Okay, so here is my reading of Bonapartism and Fascism by Leon Trotsky. I'm prefacing it with some remarks of my own, providing a little bit of context and talking about why I think this is a interesting, valuable essay at the moment. If you don't want to hear any of that, you can skip ahead to the start of the actual reading, which begins at roughly 16 and a half minutes into this file. So this article by Trotsky is addressing the situation in France in mid-1934. It's to do with the fact that in February 1934, there was a massive political crisis in the France of the Third Republic, which caused by something sometimes called the Veterans' Riots. It's a massive riot, largely organised by far-right groups, fascist groups in France, against French parliamentary democracy. It was put down. A lot of people on the left at the time, quite understandably, saw it as an attempt or the sign of an attempt to launch a fascist coup d'etat in France. It probably wasn't that. It was less organised than that, but the fear was understandable. It generated a response from the left, from workers, from communists in France, as Trotsky talks about. And it leads to the establishment of a sort of government of national unity in France, headed by the French statesman Doumergue that Trotsky talks about in this, Gaston Doumergue. Trotsky ends this article with his customary call for proletarian revolution. It's easy to look back now with the benefit of so much hindsight and see the idea that putting an end to fascism in Europe through a proletarian movement is it looks naive. But of course it looks naive because history fell out a certain way. The war happened. You can just as easily say the war happened and fascism did not decay, was not overthrown in Europe, because the workers, the proletarian workers' revolt against it does not happen. And that's not for... One thing you can't accuse Trotsky of is not calling for it, not agitating for it. He's trying to say that it needs to be done, and that if it doesn't happen, the consequences will be catastrophic. And, of course, it didn't happen, and they were. I think there's lots of... For people that aren't steeped in it, there's going to be lots of names and references in here that are going to be a bit obscure, a bit confusing. I would say don't worry about it unless it's something that really grabs your interest, because I don't think the specifics of the political situation that Trotsky's directly addressing himself to, that's not the point for me. The point of this essay is that the thing that I think is valuable about it is that it takes on to be crude about it, it takes on both the simplistic idea that because bourgeois democracy serves capital, because bourgeois democracy is reactionary, because bourgeois democracy is repressive, bourgeois democracy is therefore fascism, or exactly the same as fascism, or almost the same as fascism, or that the two things are just two sides of the same coin, or whatever, that you can collapse them down into each other. Or it's the essence of the Stalinist theory of social fascism, where the social democratic political formations are essentially exactly the same as the fascist the fascist political groups. They're just different iterations of the same thing, which was a catastrophic analysis because it led to a catastrophic tactic, a catastrophic strategy, I should say, of neglecting to unite with social democratic forces against fascist parties. The great thing about this article, it's a representative of a lot of things that Trotsky wrote about this, doesn't just argue against that, which is that reductive and simplistic idea and dangerous idea. It also goes into the complexities of this, because he says just as equally, of course they are related. Of course they are related social and political forms. They're both forms of capitalist government. Trotsky here applies himself to a very crucial category in Marxist analyses of these sorts of issues, Bonapartism. Bonapartism here doesn't refer to Napoleon Bonaparte of the the hand in the jacket and the big hat and all that sort of thing. Joaquin Phoenix, it's because Joaquin Phoenix looks exactly like, every time up until now I've seen Joaquin Phoenix, I've been thinking, Joker and all the other things he's been in. I was sitting there the whole time thinking, God, he looks like Napoleon. So it's good that somebody finally. Anyway, yeah, it doesn't refer to him. It refers to Louis Bonaparte, who's of course same family, descendant. Louis Bonaparte was he was the French president in the 1840s, elected, sort of, and then he staged a coup d'etat against his own government, essentially, in 1851, and set up a kind of military dictatorship with lots of populist rhetoric, reactionary populist rhetoric. He is the Bonaparte that Marx is writing about in the famous pamphlet, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, in which he describes the situation where class struggle situation in France where it makes it possible for a grotesque mediocrity to play a hero's part. Read that pamphlet. There's a lot of stuff in there that sounds familiar about various people in the political world today. Marxists come to use the term Bonapartism essentially to mean a kind of a capitalist government that occurs when the balance of forces between the classes is insecure and the class rule of the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, doesn't feel secure, or they don't feel secure about it. And they respond with a kind of an intense authoritarianism, a military state, a police state, in combination with a repressive state bureaucracy. And it's a useful category because certainly the way Trotsky is using it as related to, similar to, even transitional with fascism, but is not identical, as not the same thing. And that's a very useful distinction to make, I think, because it allows you to disambiguate regimes. For instance, in our time, we can look back to regimes like the Pinochet regime in Chile, which is kind of the paradigmatic example of an extreme right-wing authoritarian bureaucratic police state, military state government that is not actually fascist in the sense that it doesn't come about as a result of a mass movement, because the key thing in the definition of fascism is that it is the result of a fascist movement, a mass fascist movement which has its base in the petty bourgeoisie, the middle classes, lower state functionaries, police, people like that, people in the middle. And it's not police in the sense of the government sets up a police state. It's more in the sense that because of their class position, people in the police are drawn towards a kind of an authoritarian reactionary politics and thus to an authoritarian reactionary political movement, like Trumpism, for instance. The basis of Trumpism is in the middle classes. It's in the petty bourgeoisie. It's in the police and people like that. And there you can see, this is exactly why I think this is a useful and interesting bit of writing to share, because Trotsky's talking about exactly how these two phenomena are related and interrelated, how they sort of bleed into each other. And that's a really good example, because MAGA in America now is undoubtedly a fascist movement. It is a authoritarian, anti-democratic, reactionary, social movement, social mass movement, based in the middle classes, the petty bourgeoisie, lower state functionaries, exactly those people that the Marxists identified as the basis of it. Trotsky called them the human dust. Essentially, they're the people with no real class identity. They're not really part of the working class. They're not really part of the upper class. They're the people eternally in the middle, and you will always get a section of them that can be drawn to extreme anti-working class and also apparently aesthetically anti-ruling class politics. And that's what fascism is. Fascism doesn't say the government is great, the rulers of the world are great, the capitalists are great, let's be in a movement to support them. Fascism, it frames its populist message exactly around saying to people, well, the dirty left-wing workers and the dirty immigrants and dirty foreigners and the dirty you-know-who, all these other groups of people that the people in the privileged petty bourgeois middle-class groups don't like, whether it be woke teachers or trans people or whatever these days, and also the dirty bankers and the dirty capitalists and the dirty corporate raiders and the swamp, the political class, the corrupt politicians, all these people, they are the enemy. And the fascist movement is formed from a kind of a populist revolt from within the middle class against both the below and the above, and the spurious linking of the two as a sort of great big conspiracy against the real people, the salt of the earth proper people, who are, of course, them. They're the people they're talking about. A Bonapartist regime doesn't require any of that. A Bonapartist regime is basically just the government saying, right, you may not say this now. You may not strike. You may not say these things. You may not join this political party. You may not speak ill of the government. You will do as you're told, or if you don't, the police or the military will kill you. That isn't to say, by the way, that Bonapartist regimes don't contain aspects of popular movements, that they don't address themselves to popular feeling. They do. They get support from reactionary sectors of the population. Marx talks about exactly this in the 18th Brumaire. And obviously there's a relationship between the two, because fascist governments do that too, but it's not the same phenomenon. This is exactly the sort of thing that Trotsky is trying to disambiguate in this essay. He's disambiguating from, as an analytical and theoretical category. He's trying to get clarity on this. He's disambiguating fascism and fascist movements from Bonapartist governments, authoritarian, reactionary, but essentially top-down, state-imposed regimes. And he's also disambiguating it from social democratic or reformist movements, or social democratic or reformist governments, because this is precisely the elision that was being committed, this fatal elision that was being committed in the supposed line, the theoretical line of so much of the supposed communist left in this era. There's a very fine moment in this where he talks about how, yes, fascism is the rule of finance capital, but in a different way so is Bonapartism, and in a different way so is social democracy. Because finance capital, in his analysis at this point in time, is the dominant class power, and therefore, in those societies, where it's the dominant class power, it's going to generate governments whose primary task is to govern for it in its interests. That's kind of a banality. It's a given that fascism is going to be that, because it's not a proletarian government, it's a bourgeois government, so of course it's going to serve the most hegemonic and most powerful sector of capitalist power. You can't conclude from that that's all it is, or that it's the direct rule of finance capital through sort of puppets or anything like that, because that's not how it works in any of these formations. You also can't conclude from that because other parties or other kinds of government, like Bonapartist national governments or social democratic reformist governments, because they do the same thing, you can't conclude from that there's some sort of identity between these different social and political formations. That's nonsense. As Trotsky insists upon, fascism is a specific means whereby a specific class or group of classes can be mobilized in order to create a government that will be conducive to the rule of finance capital. Trotsky makes a very important point via his analysis of the Pilsudski regime in Poland. Again, you might not have heard of it. Most people haven't. I think it's clear from the context what's going on when you listen to what Trotsky says. Via his analysis of that regime, he makes the point that you can't judge what is or isn't fascist by some sort of Platonic ideal, a sort of eternal fascism as such, against which every regime and every party has to be judged on a sort of checklist, where does it have all these traits? No, then it's not. That is not a dialectical way of looking at it, and Trotsky is, of course, insistent upon the dialectical method of analysis. And this is one of in this essay. This essay contains an argument as to why that's necessary. And I think these are important points now when we do have mass fascist movements in the world, and we do have a form of late capitalist government which, under ongoing crises, is sort of auto-forming into a kind of Bonapartism, using that old, under the guise of democracy, with all these democratic trappings still on top, and all the democratic rhetoric still on top, which is analogous to the social democratic reformism that Trotsky is talking about. So you can, I think anyway, you can look upon global capitalist governments now as tending structurally under the influence of long-term secular crisis, a long-term secular crisis of profitability and several other related crises. It's mutating and tending structurally towards a kind of a permanent Bonapartism, to use that term, which nonetheless has these aesthetic trappings of democracy and reformism and even left progressivism. And at the same time, you have an outright fascist movement, which is still in America, certainly, it's still in the phase of trying to achieve power electorally or quasi-electorally, because Donald Trump will claim he won in 2024, no matter what happens. And he has a Congress that is, the Speaker of the House now is a guy who was actively involved in the last coup d'etat attempt. So, and I think a certain clarity on the distinctions between these things, as well as the similarities and the continuities of these things and their ability to flow into each other. I think that is the great virtue of this essay and lots of what Trotsky wrote in this era. So, I don't know. See what you think. Let me know. Bonapartism and Fascism by Leon Trotsky, July 1934. The vast practical importance of a correct theoretical orientation is most strikingly manifested in a period of acute social conflict, of rapid political shifts, of abrupt changes in the situation. In such periods, political conceptions and generalizations are rapidly used up and require either a complete replacement, which is easier, or their concretization, precision, or partial rectification, which is harder. It is in just such periods that all sorts of transitional, intermediate situations and combinations arise, as a matter of necessity, which upset the customary patterns and doubly require a sustained theoretical attention. In a word, if in the Pacific and organic period, before the war, one could still live on the revenue from a few ready-made abstractions, in our time, each new event forcefully brings home the most important law of the dialectic. The truth is always concrete. The Stalinist theory of fascism indubitably represents one of the most tragic examples of the injurious practical consequences that can follow from the substitution of the dialectical analysis of reality in its every concrete phase, in all its transitional stages, that is, in its gradual changes, as well as in its revolutionary or counter-revolutionary leaps, by abstract categories, formulated upon the basis of a partial and insufficient historical experience, or a narrow and insufficient view of the whole. The Stalinists adopted the idea that in the contemporary period finance capital cannot accommodate itself to parliamentary democracy and is obliged to resort to fascism. From this idea, absolutely correct within certain limits, they draw in a purely deductive, formally logical manner the same conclusions for all the countries and for all stages of development. To them, Primo de Rivera, Mussolini, Chiang Kai-shek, Masaryk, Brüning, Dollfuss, Pilsudski, the Serbian King Alexander, Severin, MacDonald, etc., were the representatives of fascism. In doing this, they forgot A, that in the past, too, capitalism never accommodated itself to pure democracy, now supplementing it with a regime of open repression, now substituting one for it. B, that pure finance capitalism nowhere exists. C, that even while occupying a dominant position, finance capital does not act within a void, and is obliged to reckon with the other strata of the bourgeoisie, and with the resistance of the oppressed classes. D, that finally, between parliamentary democracy and the fascist regime, a series of transitional forms, one after another, inevitably interposes itself, now peacefully, now by civil war. And each one of these transitional forms, if we want to go forward and not be flung to the rear, demands a correct theoretical appraisal and a corresponding policy of the proletariat. On the basis of the German experience, the Bolshevik-Leninists recorded for the first time the transitional governmental form, even though it could and should already have been established on the basis of Italy, which we call Bonapartism, the Brüning, Papen, Schleicher governments. In a more precise and more developed form, We subsequently observed the Bonapartist regime in Austria. The determinism of this transitional form has become patent. Naturally, not in the fatalistic, but in the dialectical sense, that is, for the countries and periods where fascism with growing success, without encountering a victorious resistance of the proletariat, attacked the positions of parliamentary democracy in order thereupon to strangle the proletariat. During the period of Brüning-Schleicher, Manuilsky-Kuznets proclaimed, "Fascism is already here." The theory of the intermediate Bonapartist stage they declared to be an attempt to paint over and mask fascism in order to make easier for the social democracy the policy of the lesser evil. At that time, the Social Democrats were called social fascists, and the left Social Democrats of the Zyromsky-Marceau Pivert Juste type passed, after the Trotskyists, for the most dangerous social fascists. All this has changed now. With regard to present-day France, the Stalinists do not care to repeat fascism is already here. On the contrary, they have accepted the policy of the United Front, which they rejected yesterday, in order to prevent the victory of fascism in France. They have found themselves compelled to distinguish the Doumer regime from the fascist regime. But they have arrived at this distinction as empiricists, and not as Marxists. They do not even attempt to give a scientific definition of the Doumer regime. He who operates in the domain of theory with abstract categories is condemned to capitulate blindly to facts. And yet it is precisely in France that the passage from parliamentarism to Bonapartism, or more exactly the first stage of this passage, has taken on a particularly striking and demonstrative character. It suffices to recall that the Doumer government appeared on the scene between the rehearsal of the civil war by the fascists, February 6th, and the general strike of the proletariat, February 12th. As soon as the irreconcilable camps had taken up their fighting positions at the poles of capitalist society, it wasn't long before it became clear that the adding machine of parliamentarism lost all importance. It is true that the Doumer government, like the Brüning-Schleicher governments in their day, appears at first glance to govern with the assent of Parliament. But it is a Parliament which has abdicated, a Parliament which knows that in case of resistance, the government would dispense with it. Thanks to the relative equilibrium between the camp of counter-revolution which attacks and the camp of the revolution which defends itself, thanks to their temporary mutual neutralization, the axis of power has been raised above the classes and above their parliamentary representation. It was necessary to seek the head of the government outside of Parliament and outside the parties. The head of the government has called two generals to his aid. This trinity has supported itself on its right and its left by symmetrically arranged parliamentary hostages. The government does not appear as an executive organ of the parliamentary majority, but as a judge-arbiter between the two camps in struggle. A government which raises itself above the nation is not, however, suspended in air. The true axis of the present government passes through the police, the bureaucracy, the military clique. It is a military police dictatorship with which we are confronted, barely concealed with the decorations of parliamentarism. But a government of the sabre as the judge-arbiter of the nation, that's just what Bonapartism is. The sabre by itself has no independent programme. It is the instrument of order. It is summoned to safeguard what exists. Raising itself politically above the classes, Bonapartism, like its predecessor, Caesarism for that matter, represents, in the social sense, always and at all epochs, the government of the strongest and firmest part of the exploiters. Consequently, present-day Bonapartism can be nothing else than the government of finance capital, which directs, inspires, and corrupts the summits of the bureaucracy, the police, the officers' caste, and the press. The constitutional reform, about which so much has been said in the course of recent months, has as its sole task the adaptation of the state institutions to the exigencies and conveniences of the Bonapartist government. Finance capital is seeking legal paths that would give it the possibility of each time imposing upon the nation the most suitable judge-arbiter with the forced assent of the quasi-parliament. It is evident that the Doumer government is not the ideal of a strong government. More suitable candidates for a Bonaparte exist in reserve. New experiences and combinations are possible in this domain if the future course of the class struggle is to leave them enough time. In prognosticating, we are obliged to repeat what the Bolshevik-Leninists said at one time about Germany. The political chances of present French Bonapartism are not great. Its stability is determined by the temporary and at bottom unsteady equilibrium between the camps of the proletariat and fascism. The relation of forces of these two camps must change rapidly in part under the influence of the economic conjuncture, principally in dependence upon the quality of the proletarian vanguard's policy. The collision between these two camps is inevitable. The timescale of the process will be calculated in months and not in years. A stable regime could be established only after the collision, depending upon the results. Fascism in power, like Bonapartism, can only be the government of finance capital. In this social sense, it is indistinguishable not only from Bonapartism, but even from parliamentary democracy. Each time, the Stalinists made this discovery all over again, forgetting that social questions resolve themselves in the domain of the political. The strength of finance capital does not reside in its ability to establish a government of any kind and at any time according to its wish. It does not possess this faculty. Its strength resides in the fact that every non-proletarian government is forced to serve finance capital, or better yet, that finance capital possesses the possibility of substituting for each one of its systems of domination that decays another system corresponding better to the changed conditions. However, the passage from one system to another signifies the political crisis which, with the concourse of the activity of the revolutionary proletariat, may be transformed into a social danger to the bourgeoisie. The passage of parliamentary democracy to Bonapartism itself was accompanied in France by an effervescence of civil war. The perspective of the passage from Bonapartism to fascism is pregnant with infinitely more formidable disturbances, and consequently also revolutionary possibilities. Up to yesterday, the Stalinists considered that our main mistake was to see in fascism the petty bourgeoisie and not finance capital. In this case, too, they put abstract categories in place of the dialectics of the classes. Fascism is a specific means of mobilizing and organizing the petty bourgeoisie in the social interests of finance capital. During the democratic regime, capital inevitably attempted to inoculate the workers with confidence in the reformist and pacifist petty bourgeoisie. The passage to fascism, on the contrary, is inconceivable without the preceding permeation of the petty bourgeoisie with hatred of the proletariat. The domination of one and the same superclass, finance capital, rests in these two systems upon directly opposite relations of oppressed classes. The political mobilization of the petty bourgeoisie against the proletariat, however, is inconceivable without that social demagogy which means playing with fire for the big bourgeoisie. The danger to order of the unleashed petty bourgeois reaction has just been confirmed by the recent events in Germany. That is why, while supporting and actively financing reactionary banditry in the form of one of its wings, the French bourgeoisie seeks not to push matters to the point of the political victory of fascism, aiming only at the establishment of a strong power, which, in the last analysis, is to discipline the two extreme camps. What has been said sufficiently demonstrates how important it is to distinguish the Bonapartist form of power from the fascist one. Yet it would be unpardonable to fall into the opposite extreme, that is, to convert Bonapartism and fascism into two logically incompatible categories. Just as Bonapartism begins by combining the parliamentary regime with fascism, so triumphant fascism finds itself forced not only to enter into a bloc with the Bonapartists, but what is more, to draw closer internally to the Bonapartist system. The prolonged domination of finance capital by means of reactionary social demagogy and petty bourgeois terror is impossible. Having arrived in power, the fascist chiefs are forced to muzzle the masses who follow them by means of the state apparatus. By the same token, they lose the support of broad masses of the petty bourgeoisie. A small part of it is assimilated by the bureaucratic apparatus, another sinks into indifference. A third, under various banners, passes into opposition, and while losing its social mass base, by resting upon the bureaucratic apparatus and oscillating between the classes, fascism is regenerated into Bonapartism. Here, too, the gradual evolution is cut into by violent and sanguinary episodes. Differing from pre-fascist or preventive Bonapartism, Giolitti, Brüning-Schleicher, Dumergue, etc., which reflects the extremely unstable and short-lived equilibrium between the belligerent camps, Bonapartism of fascist origin, Mussolini, Hitler, etc., which grew out of the destruction, the disillusionment, and the demoralization of the two camps of the masses, distinguishes itself by its much greater stability. The question, fascism or Bonapartism, has engendered certain differences on the subject of the Pilsudski regime among our Polish comrades. The very possibility of such differences testifies best to the fact that we are dealing not with inflexible logical categories, but with living social formations, which represent extremely pronounced peculiarities in different countries and at different stages. Pilsudski came to power at the end of an insurrection based upon a mass movement of the petty bourgeoisie and aimed directly at the domination of the traditional bourgeois parties in the name of the strong state. This is a fascist trait, characteristic of the movement and of the regime. But the specific political weight, that is, the mass of Polish fascism, was much weaker than that of Italian fascism in its time, and still more than that of German fascism. To a much greater degree, Pilsudski had to make use of the methods of military conspiracy, and to put the question of the workers' organizations in a much more circumspect manner. It suffices to recall that Pilsudski's coup d'état took place with the sympathy and the support of the Polish party of the Stalinists. The growing hostility of the Ukrainian and Jewish petty bourgeoisie towards the Pilsudski regime made it, in turn, more difficult for him to launch a general attack upon the working class. As a result of such a situation, the oscillation between the classes, and the national parts of the classes, occupied and still occupies with Pilsudski a much greater place, and mass terror a much smaller place, than in the corresponding periods with Mussolini or Hitler. There is the Bonapartist element in the Pilsudski regime. Nevertheless, it would be patently false to compare Pilsudski to Giolitti or to Schleicher, and to look forward to his being relieved by a new Polish Mussolini or Hitler. It is methodologically false to form an image of some ideal fascism, and to oppose it to this real fascist regime which has grown up with all its peculiarities and contradictions upon the terrain of the relationship of classes and nationalities in the Polish state. Will Pilsudski be able to lead the action of destruction of the proletarian organizations to the very end? And the logic of this situation drives him inevitably on this path. It does not depend upon the formal definition of fascism as such, but upon the true relationship of forces, the dynamics of the political processes taking place in the masses, the strategy of the proletarian vanguard, finally, the course of events in Western Europe, and above all in France. History may successfully inscribe the fact that Polish fascism was overthrown and reduced to dust before it succeeded in finding for itself a totalitarian form of expression. We said above that Bonapartism of fascist origin is incomparably more stable than the preventive Bonapartist experiments to which the big bourgeoisie resorts in the hope of avoiding fascist bloodletting. Nevertheless, it is still more important, from the theoretical and practical point of view, to emphasize that the very fact of the regeneration of fascism into Bonapartism signifies the beginning of its end. How long a time the withering away of fascism will last, and at what moment its malady will turn into agony, depends upon many internal and external causes. But the fact that the counter-revolutionary activity of the petty bourgeoisie is quenched, that it is disillusioned, that it is disintegrating, and that its attack upon the proletariat is weakening, opens up new revolutionary possibilities. All history shows that it is impossible to keep the proletariat enchained with the aid merely of the police apparatus. It is true that the experience of Italy shows that the psychological heritage of the enormous catastrophe experienced maintains itself among the working class much longer than the relationship between the forces which engendered the catastrophe. But the psychological inertia of the defeat is but a precarious prop. It can crumble at a single blow under the impact of a powerful convulsion. Such a convulsion, for Italy, Germany, Austria, and other countries, could be the success of the struggle of the French proletariat. The revolutionary key to the situation in Europe and in the entire world is now above all in France.